Hey guys, welcome back. Let's get to it. Let's start talking about your psychology issues you have and how to work through them. The solution is, well, it's spiritual. Ultimately, it's a spiritual solution. Let's take back that term. The Sedona crowd really bastardized it over the past 20 years, but let's take it back because I do think it's fundamental. Can't do your homework, you wake up on YouTube, can't stick to a regimen, can't stick to a routine. Can't talk to girls. You see a girl over there, it's like there's an invisible barrier between you and her, you and your father, you and your mother. We'll get to it today. Deliverance from the mother. There is a spiritual solution. It's not about doing the homework. It's not about talking to the girl. It's not about saying one thing or another thing to your father. Right? It's not about sticking to a plan, listening to more Jocko Willink. It's about a connection issue. Really what spiritual means ultimately is a connection issue, a connection with yourself, a connection with other people. Is there even a difference psychologically? Philosophically there is, but psychologically there isn't. So the first step, I think, the most helpful step is connection with yourself. And that means, how do your emotions work? Really, how do they work? What are emotions? How do they work? Let's get into it. I think this is fundamental. Separation from the mother. That's what we're going to talk about today. Deliverance from the mother. I had something else I want to talk about. I want to talk about the big tech thing going on. The big tech monopoly hearings. I don't know exact congressional hearings. I don't know exactly what's going on. I'm not sitting around watching C-SPAN. I'm pretty boring over here. We're not quite that boring. I'm sure it'll get there. But, I'm not an economist, so I'm not thinking about this like an economist. I do know some things about economics, and if any of this is incorrect, please let me know. But I'm just listening to what's happening. I'm going to Google News, paradoxically, or maybe not, going to Google News and seeing, just getting glimpses of what's going on. And I cannot help but think about positive psychology. I mean, the same epistemological, philosophical error behind these antitrust hearings, which, just to lay it out there, I'm totally against. It's the same mentality behind positive psychology. I don't know. We just feel like being positive, being happy, and if it's not happiness, it's something else, right? So everybody's gets worn out on happiness. The same people who got us worn out on spirituality. Even though I think happiness is important, spirituality is important, we get worn out on it because you're just talking about it without understanding what's at the root of it. But it doesn't matter what word you use. So Tim Ferriss comes along and says, no, it's not about happiness, it's about how to be excited. That doesn't matter either. There's going to be an error as long as you're sticking to this ideal, right? This platonic ideal of what you think human emotion should be, what you think your psychological state should always be, whether it's happiness, at peace. Go back to Sedona, excited. It's like a little bit higher testosterone kind of happiness. The problem is that you think that there's one ideal state. So what positive psychology does, and this is CBT, this is the cognitive hegemony in psychology, is okay, there's one positive state. So if there's one ideal state. So if you lapse out of that state, something must be wrong. And what we need to do is just correct that lapse out of the ideal state of positivity, happiness. So you can go on and then be positive or happy, right? That makes sense. I mean, if we're a software developer and there's a bad line of code, you get rid of the line of code so it works. That's how your psychology works. And that's how antitrust legislation works. If a company's, so we have this platonic ideal of I think it's called like ideal competition. So as soon as one company gets an innovation, then all the other companies in the field catch up. So any company that has more of the market share, that's not ideal competition, and that company ends up charging more, which does happen. That company ends up charging more. I would say that's the price. That's the price we pay for innovation. Otherwise, what's the incentive for innovation if they can't charge more? If in this ideal competitive scenario that you have, this platonic competition, as soon as there's an innovation, everybody else gets the innovation. Well, what would be the incentive for having an innovation if you couldn't charge a little bit? Now, you can't charge whatever you want. I mean, certain companies can, but I don't think that has anything to do with there being a company. So what do? We want to come in and take take market share away from these companies by force. Just like you want to come in and, oh, we're not in this ideal state, we're a little bit not happy, let's take it away by force. Let's give you a drug, let's give you affirmations, sit there and watch a bunch of Jocko Willing videos. It will take you out of that negative state, that not ideal psychological state, like we're taking these companies up. You're not in an ideal competitive thing here. Environment. So we need to do something to eliminate. And of course, like the positive psychology, like the cognitive therapy, you don't understand the state that you view as not ideal. And so what ends up happening is you put regulations in, right? This is cognitive behavioral therapy. This is positive psychology. This is make yourself happy, even if you're not happy. If you don't feel like smiling, smile for a minute and you're going to feel better, which just ends up not being true, of course. I mean, to talk about another study that wasn't replicated. And you don't get to the root of the issue. Right? You never figure out the root of the issue. Part of figuring out the problem is going into the depression, going into the anxiety. It's not a sign that something's bad. There's nothing wrong with the quote negative emotion. Like there's nothing wrong necessarily with an industry where there's a little bit of inequality between different companies. That actually makes sense. That makes sense that one company would have innovation and be able to capitalize because of that. It makes sense. Something happens you're not really prepared for. You're going to feel anxiety. You're going to feel anger, depression, all these things that we view as negative. It's not negative, of course. It's all in how we manage it, like the antitrust thing. It's nothing wrong with a company getting a market share. What's wrong is when we try to manage it, when we try to control it, what ends up happening is we cement that company into regulations. But what that ultimately is now you're starting to regulate this industry, which makes it even more difficult for companies to rise and fall. I mean, ultimately what this is a power grab. This is a power grab for Congress. There is this industry where we don't like what we see. And we're going to go in and try to fix it, and it's just going to make it worse. Just like when you feel sad and you try to make yourself happy, I understand it will work in the short term, but in the long term, it's not going to work. And I know this I'm sure a lot of you would probably agree with the antitrust hearings because Google has too much power, Twitter, Facebook, they're censoring people, it's too much power. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to say that they can't censor people? And that now what they choose to censor is up to the government and not them? Well, where does that end, right? What precedent does that cause? You think that's helping your cause now because Twitter or Facebook may be censoring people who you may think are totally normal. And I agree. I think their views are normal too. And they, quote, should be allowed to be posted on these sites. But that's not the point. The point is now you're setting up a precedent for the government to come in and manipulate this field. Like you're setting up a precedent. Whenever you feel sad, you come in and manipulate your psychology to get the short-term gratification that you want. You don't look at what you're doing holistically. Sorry to use another Sedona word. You don't look at what you're doing holistically to your psychology, to the economy when you come in with this third party and change things by force. And it's always going to lead to negative consequences down the line. I mean, if you put that much power in an economy, where does it stop? It doesn't stop. And this has been antitrust regulation for the past 100 plus years. And of course, what ends up happening is we get real, not monarchies, monopolies. We get real monopolies now. I mean, that's exactly what happened in the banking industry. I mean, look at Chase Bank. That is a government institution. I mean, everybody's talking about fascism, anti-fascism. That's what real fascism is. It's like, yeah, there's still some semblance of free market capitalism, but really the government's in control of the industry. The government's in control of the large corporations. That's really what fascism is. I don't know if we need some clarification on that. I know if fascism just means anybody you disagree with now, but that's ultimately what it is. And that's what you're doing. You're essentially being a fascist to your mind. When you have emotion you don't really like, oh, let's do whatever we can to get rid of it. It's not ideal. It's not the platonic ideal of how I want my emotions to be, this positive, happy, excited state. What you need to do is go into the emotion and figure out what's there. And I am not blaming you, because nobody's really showed you how emotions work. Nobody's even talked about that. Right? What do I always say? You go talk to any psychologist, ask them what an emotion is. Their first response is always going to be, well, there's many different interpretations. That's not good enough. What's way better is to give a definite answer that's wrong, because at least we can test that and iterate. But just, oh, well, there's a bunch of different opinions, and we're never really come to a firm consensus on what an emotion is. Okay. And that's why we have the mental health issue going on in America right now. And that's, epistemologically similar why we have this antitrust legislation going on now. And we think it's actually going to help. We actually think it's going to do something. It's not. It's definitely not. It's going to do the exact opposite. That's what happens here. And that's what happens in your psychology. All right. So last week I was talking about the Symbols of Transformation, Volume 5. And then I said, well, I probably won't talk about it next week. I'm sure I'll come up with something else to talk about. Let's keep talking about Symbols of Transformation. Although I'm just trying to figure out the best way, because I really like Jung. Again, not a Jungian, but I really like Jung. I think he has lots of wisdom for us, especially in whatever crisis that you think that we're in. I think there is a ton of wisdom in Jung. Like taking back the word spiritual. That's not really a word that he used, but essentially what he's talking about is spirituality. Can't talk to the girl. Maybe it's not how you talk to the girl, or not talk to the girl. Maybe it's how you talk to other people in your life. Maybe it's how you talk to your mom. Maybe it's how you separate from your mom. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So there's one section in Symbols of Transformation called The Deliverance from the Mother. As I talked about last week, Symbols of Transformation, this was written when Jung was 36, and it represented really the beginning of the end, the separation point from Freud. He said, look, if a human is going to change, transform, it happens in the same way each time. And let's look at symbols through which we transform, because how do we depict transformation up until psychology? Well, religion to some extent, but religion is just a bunch of stories. Yeah, stories, right? Stories and myth. That is the depiction of transformation, of human transformation. So let's look at stories and myth. Let's look at religion. Let's look at these stories that have been around for a really long time and figure out what's going on, so we can kind of distill it down to the fundamental principles of transformation. And this isn't overall transformation. This is just going from one stage of adult development to the next, as I would depict them. A separation from the parents, getting good being alone, getting good with friends, getting good, a sexual initiation, getting good expressing your sexuality, incorporating that part of your life in a healthy way, getting good with relationships and emotions, and then generativity, giving back to the next generation. So this is the points between each stage of adult development. Unless we could talk about two kinds of thinking, some symbolism. We introduced Miss Frank Miller and her prodromal stages of schizophrenia. The beginning, the inception of schizophrenia, before it really was schizophrenia, but she's having these visions that indicate, yeah, this is what's going on. She's being split in a sense. She's disconnected from reality. She's disconnecting her unconscious from reality, and it's not going to get a positive outlet. Her unconscious way of being, it's not going to get a positive expression in reality, because she's cutting it off now. So let's go through these visions that she's having where we're seeing, oh yeah, she's really starting to be disconnected here. Really what she can't separate from her parents, specifically her father. And because of that, she's going to go on and be split in a sense, right? That's the schizo. You're split off. There are parts of your mind that are split off that you don't want to deal with, indicating inability to really integrate with reality in a healthy way. So last week we talked about the first few stages, the origin of the hero, just the hero is a libido projection, and just think of libido as psychic energy. It is a projection of our psychic energy, and the changes that the hero goes through is really the changes that our libido goes through. If you look at my emotional diagrams, the libido is just what decision are you making with the emotion. Right? We can only make 3 decisions with each emotion. That's essentially where your psychic energy is going. That's really all it is. So we have these heroes, and then we because it's just a representation of what we need to do with our libido. That's why it's so powerful. It's what we all need to do. And then there's the symbol of the mother and rebirth. Talked about that. So like I was talking about, cities and churches. Right? These are just symbols of the mother, symbols of sanctuary, symbols of going in and being comforted by the mother. That is going to the previous stage of adult development. So if you're working on your sexual initiation, I mean, what do guys do when they go out to the bar and they try to talk to a girl and they go over and talk to her and it doesn't go well? Right? What happens? They go back to their buddies and go, "Oh boy, that hope nobody saw that." Right? That is an attempt at healthy libido development. Healthy libido use in the world. But it's okay to revert back to the mother in this case. Revert back to your friends. Get a drink. That's another symbol for the mother, drinking. I mean, it fills us up with a motherly kind of comforting, a scotch glass is really a glass of a hug. That's why you go to Alaska and it's predominantly men, right? 3-to-1 men. Everybody's an alcoholic. There's no woman. You have to cultivate the inner woman in a different way. Not the healthiest way to do it, but it definitely gets at that feeling of, being wrapped in a woman, let's just say, to put it politely. But then you're with your friends at the bar. You can't stay there. Otherwise, you're going to regress, and you're, in a sense, going to cut off the libido from reality, and then you're going to get something like schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia, back in Jung's time, was really used as a catch-all term for this splitting, this complex in your mind that just gets split off to such a degree you don't even see it anymore, and then any interaction with the world after that point is just not going to be, it's not going to be very healthy. Because you're really not interacting with yourself. You're interacting with you're interacting with the world, yes, but also you're interacting with the complex about your father, like Miss Frank Miller has. So, you're back in the mother. You're back in the previous stage of adult development. The next thing you need to do is to battle for deliverance from the mother. Battle for deliverance from that previous stage of adult development. And this is what Jung talks about in part 2, Section 6. So it starts off, so I'm going to talk about this in a little bit different way, as I was saying, so I can just get better communicating these ideas to you, because I think last week didn't go too well. I was trying to talk about too much, so this week we're just going to talk about one section in one part, and I think this is going to go a little bit better. So it starts out, this is paragraph 420. The first thing I'm going to talk about here is 420 to 425. So Miss Miller has a vision. I think it's a hypnagogic vision, which means, those little visions that you have when you're falling asleep. And what's it called when you have a vision as you're waking up? I had one this morning. Well, what's that called? Hypnosymptic? I forget the name. But hypnagogic vision is the visions you have when you're falling asleep. So a forest appears, which is, of course, maternal significance, and this Indian Chiwantopel. I really don't know how to pronounce it. I've actually never said it out loud or heard it said out loud until I tried to do it there. Chiwantopel. I'll just call it that. He comes out of the forest on a horse and he bears his chest to an Indian. So Chiwantopel is an Indian. And there's a lot of explanation here, like why Americans have visions about Indians. Jung sees it as like our unconscious, like this part of us that like we don't, our shadow in a sense, very much indicated in The Shining, right? Our past with American Indians, that's like a shadow element of America. So when Americans having a vision about an Indian, it's something about that American that they really don't want to look at. So Chiwantopel comes out on a horse, an Indian goes to shoot arrows at him. Chiwantopel bears his breast. He opens up his shirt, I guess, and he bears his breast. And almost like saying, "Come on, shoot me. Let's do it." Almost like daring him to daring the other Indian to shoot him, but the Indian doesn't, and he slinks away. So there's lots of symbolism here. So we'll get to what this means about deliverance from the mother. But I think it is kind of interesting that she has these visions, and we can look at the symbolism. I don't know, right? Just like any dream analysis, is this objectively true? Well, no, but it's psychically true, in that we can make meaning out of it and look at what Miss Frank Miller is really going through because of it. So on horseback, horseback is often associated with libido, with these lower urges. That's why in Twin Peaks, when Bob, possessing Laura's dad, I forget his name, Laura's dad, when he kills Maddie, right, Laura's cousin, a pale horse appears. I think this is just a symbolism for, our baser, our lower parts, our wilder elements, our untamed elements. And so this is what it represents for Miss Miller. And also what's important here is that the Chiwon Topel scene reminds Miss Miller, right? She's this fairly well-read. Especially considering now, this is back in 1900, but this is a fairly well-read young woman. She's 20 years old, and she's like, oh, this reminds me of that scene from Julius Caesar, which I had talked about on the other video that I do this on this channel. The scene between Cassius and Brutus. Where Brutus accuses Cassius of having mother issues, he accuses Cassius of something that Cassius didn't do, and Cassius goes off on a tirade and cannot respond to the criticism very well. So he goes off on a tirade, and Brutus accuses Cassius of having mother issues. Like, the reason why that you're reacting in such a hysterical way is because you still haven't separated from your mom. And Cassius kind of goes, yeah, you're right. And this is what it reminds Miss Miller of, which is important. This reminds her of the mother issue. So what's really going on? Why is Chiwon Topel, however you say it, why is he bearing his breast? And especially, why did the Indians slink away? Well, what did the arrows represent? The arrows represent death, but what kind of death? We were talking about psychological death. This is a synagogic vision. Synagogic. No, I forget how you say it. Synagogic vision. Whatever. This is a vision that she's having when she's falling asleep. So this is representative of psychological death. This is representative of the death that she needs to go through to separate from her. No, hypnagogic. Why was I saying sin? Hypnagogic vision that she's having when she's separating from her parents. Right? That's the death that she needs to go through. So it's very peculiar that the Indian, even though Chiwon Topel doesn't bears his breath, the Indian slinks away. The arrows represent death, but they also represent love. And previously we talked about, in Symbols of Transformation also last week, that this is after Miss Frank Miller develops a crush on an Italian officer when she's on the ship in Europe. But she's not allowed, right? She can't let herself develop this relationship. She can't allow herself to use her libidinal energy. And we're not just talking sexuality, because this is Jung, not Freud. This is just psychic energy, right? So she can't let her use her libidinal energy in a way that allows her to, create a healthy relationship with another man besides her father, because she's still too attached to her parents. It's just, it's always fascinating to me whenever I'm talking to guys and they're like, oh yeah, I have a difficult time with girls. Girls don't like me. I just don't get attention from girls. And then I start asking them about their past and what's really going on. And it's very clear that, no, women have been interested in them. But they cut it off. They self-sabotage. They don't act they're too afraid to act. They're too afraid to do anything. It's like, are women really not interested in you? No, there's plenty of women interested in you. You just don't allow yourself to see it. And a lot of the times that has nothing to do with, you just got to say the right thing. It's the entire mentality that you're bringing to the interaction. And a mentality because that you have because you haven't really separated from either your mom or your dad. Specifically, I would say your mom, but if it's your dad, then it's your dad acting as your mom. We can still have Oedipal issues with our dad, especially if they tend to be maybe more nurturing. There's plenty of women interested in you. You just don't do anything about it. This Italian officer is interested in you, Miss Miller. You just don't do anything about it because you're too attached to your dad. You haven't separated. The Indian's there to shoot the arrows, but you don't want them. You don't want the arrows of love, of death. Same thing. It's all about initiation into the next stage of adult development. You're not accepting them. That's why you're having these visions. And you can't operate well. Paragraph 431, when we don't separate from our parents, we act as a child in the world, demanding immediate gratification. Right? So what's the immediate gratification when you come up to the challenge in a possible love life with this Italian officer? Just have a vision about him. Yeah. So like Cassius's reaction to Brutus's accusation, Chiwon Topo's gesture is too theatrical, in a sense. It's too overblown. It's too overblown to just this natural development. I mean, she's 20 years old now. This natural development into, this sounds like partially sexual initiation. She's not going to go. And she's going to make a scene about not going. You just cannot separate. And then from paragraphs 446 to 449 around here, there's this really good poem by Nietzsche where, Nietzsche's really the first real psychologist. The first depth psychologist. There are other psychologists at this time doing, experimental researches, and it was fine, and there's some good information there, and, a lot of good case studies from this time. The case studies from this time are really fascinating because they're case studies, and they're really great to read. To go back to Jung, his first volume, I think, Psychiatric Researches. It just goes through case studies. It's just interesting to see them, how they would write about cases without any, before they even thought that psychology was really going to be a field. So there's no pretension. It's just really unfiltered case studies. It's really fascinating to see how they thought about people. Maybe I'll talk about that in another video, but yeah, so there's this poem by Nietzsche, and I think it's 446, or around here. And Nietzsche is essentially saying, look, the problem isn't the problem. Something that I talk about a lot here, and it's maybe become more popularly known, but this is a big deal to say at the time. Your psychological issue isn't the issue. It is your refusal to know the issue. It's the refusal to look at the issue. And what Jung is essentially doing is describing the next stage in Miss Frank Miller's psychotic break, or schizophrenic break from reality. There's this issue. There's Italian officer. There's this love. There's this natural thing that's happening in her. And it's not that the love is happening, but it's her unconscious refusal to accept it. That's what's going to cause the problem. And then this isn't the only paragraph where Jung talks about this, but in paragraph 447, the distinction between the personal and the collective unconscious, and why this distinction is really helpful, and it's something that I've talked about a lot, and I think it's super vital. Part of the problem, part of Miss Miller's problem here, I think Jung is inferring, is she feels a problem. She feels some problem, she definitely has these sexual feelings for this Italian officer, and she sees it as her problem, not a problem she has. So when you look at the collective unconscious as opposed to just the personal unconscious, which was what Freud thought, then everything was your problem. Oh, this is because of you and your repression. But as I was talking about last week, well, if that was true, then you just unearth these repressions and the neurosis would be solved. But that's not what happens. So part of the issue, part of why we have such a difficult time looking at our unconscious issues, these things we're avoiding, because we think, oh, this is something about us, as opposed to this is something about humanity. This is something that everybody goes through, and now we are experiencing it. This is objectifying the demon, and you can only see that when you understand the unconscious as at least part collective. We're all going through these stages of adult development. We all do the thing where we go talk to the girl at the bar and it doesn't work out, and we go and retreat back to our friends. That's a lot more fun experience when you realize that, this isn't something about me. This is something that simply every guy goes through to some extent. And maybe a guy who's a little bit more ahead with me than I am regarding anything, regarding talking to your dad, talking to a girl, sticking to a routine, negotiating with the routine throughout the day. It's just a different stage of development. And I just need to go through these stages of development. But when we view it as our issue, when we can't objectify the issue, and I would even go the next stage, right? If we can't objectify the emotion behind the issue, then of course we're just naturally going to turn in on it. And there's really good indication of the symbolism that was in later in Philip Pullman's His Dark Material series. The paradise as being indicative of not a state of lack of knowledge so much, but really the state of prepubescent childhood. When you weren't burdened with all this knowledge. But it's not about, but it's, there's obviously nothing wrong with growing out of the state of paradise, as indicated in His Dark Materials and of course first in Genesis. But it's how do you integrate that knowledge? That's what's going on with Miss Miller. How do you integrate this knowledge? How do you integrate a new challenge? Do you turn away from it? That's what Miss Miller's doing. You're going to get something like schizophrenia. Yeah, schizophrenic break. I'm going to get complexes. Okay, now you're not going to be interacting with the world as you. You're going to be interacting with the world, as I said. You and issues you have with your father. Resentments that you have there. I mean, that's what ends up happening here. I mean, I don't think Jung talks about resentments explicitly, but if you turn away from the Italian officer because you're too attached to your dad, or the Italian nurse because you're too attached to your mom, right? It doesn't matter. Then these resentments invariably grow. And you think it's the father, you think it's the mom. Really, it's the mom issue, the father issue, the complex that you have. Now you're interacting with the world, not as you, but through that complex. And you wonder why things don't work out. You wonder why every situation in your life just ends up in the same emotional place. You wonder why, okay, I'm going to move to a new city and it doesn't work out. Wait, I moved to a new city. Why aren't things working out? It's because it's not about the city. Right? Wherever you go, there you are. Wherever you go, there the complex is, until you can really face it for what it is and work on it. So Jung says in paragraph 449, around here, essentially, is that so the rejuvenation from this regress into the mother. This can only occur when we can use the knowledge that we are gaining from being regressed into the mother to spring forth and engage with the world in a healthy way. And a great story that Jung talks about next is between Ra and Isis. So this is around 451. So Isis is, the powerful goddess in Egypt. Different gods and goddesses in Egypt take on different roles at different times, but in this story, the one between Ra and Isis, so Ra is the prototypical sun god, Isis is the powerful goddess, but Isis wants Ra's power. So what does she do? I forget exactly what happens. She takes his sweat, or she takes his spit and makes mud out of it, and the mud turns into a snake, and the snake bites Ra, and now Ra gets sick. But he only gets sick because you're using Ra's power and infusing it into a snake, and now Ra's going to be hurt. So Isis wants something from Ra now to save him. It's like, I can save you from the snake bite. And by the way, everybody's freaking out, like, well, how can Ra be hurt? He's the sun god. How could something in his own creation be hurt? Isis says, well, I can save you, but you have to say your name. And I guess the backstory is, I don't know exactly, but Ra has this big, long name, and nobody really knows it. So the power is in his name. So really what we're dealing with symbolically here is the psychic power of, Ra's name is his healthy libidinal energy. His using his anxiety to confront threats, to create confidence, using his anger to assert needs, to create compassion. That's what the name represents. So I was like, okay, I need to be saved, so you can neutralize the venom. So he gives his name, and then Isis becomes all powerful. And this is, of course, symbolic of the Oedipal mother, right? I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to hurt you, son. That's what the Oedipal mother is saying. I'm going to hurt you, and then so I can give you the cure. And I'm going to pretend like I'm this really great person. But really what I'm doing is I'm taking away your power. I'm taking away your libidinal energy. I'm just sawing away slightly at the tendons at the back of your hamstring. So you can still walk, you still hobble around, but you kind of, you can't really flourish in the way that you really want. Yeah, so Ra wants to separate from Isis, but he can't. Right? His fear of death, his fear of being overtaken by the earth in a sense, makes him afraid. So he gives Ra his true name, his libidinal energy, and she goes on and becomes more powerful than he is. And now he's doomed. This is the battle for deliverance from the mother. And I'm going to read something here. This is paragraph 456. I don't know exactly what it is, but I have it in my notes that this is a good quotation, so I'll read it. Let's see. It might be not so insightful, but it might be. All right, 456. It begins with, the more a person shrinks. All right, so paragraph 456, volume 5, and we'll end it here. The more a person shrinks from adapting himself to reality, the greater becomes the fear which increasingly besets his path at every point. I mean, do I not say that all the freaking time about your freaking anxiety, right? You're avoiding the anxiety, the anxiety grows worse. You think you solve the problem by, developing your affirmations and psyching yourself up with Jocko Willing videos. It's not until you face the thing that you're afraid of. Can you develop that connection? Can you develop that spirituality, that spiritual experience from which a more stable life will emerge? And what we're talking about with a stable life is a healthy outlet for your libidinal energy. Thus, a vicious circle is formed. Circle. Fear of life and people cause more shrinking back, and this in turn leads to infantilism, and finally, going into the mother. The reasons for this are generally projected outside oneself. Oh yeah, this is good. The fault lies with external circumstances, or else the parents are made responsible. Blaming your dad for the issue, not the father issue. My dad crippled me. That's true when you're 10. But when you're 15, 20, 25, 30, it's the issue you have now with your father. I'm resentful of my father because he did X, Y, Z. Yeah, that's true. Your analysis, the factual analysis of that is correct. But what you're missing is that you're really speaking about your resentment. That's the issue now, because you're an adult, and how do you manage that? Okay, so yeah, the reason for this are generally projected outside oneself. I'll just read it again. The fault lies with external circumstances, or else the parents are made responsible. And indeed, it remains to be found out how much the mother is to blame for not letting the son go. The son will naturally try to explain everything by the wrong attitude of the mother, but he will do better to refrain from all such futile attempts to excuse his ineptitude by laying the blame on his parents. He's trying to excuse his ineptitude by laying the blame on the parents. Same thing with Ra and Isis. And so part of the deliverance from the mother, if you don't want to be, if you want to be a hero, right? This is what heroes do. And we know this because this is how we project out the libido in every story that we care about. The libido, the libido in a sense, but your libido. You relating with your libido, you recognize the Isis for what she is, for what she's doing, for what she's trying to do to Ra, offering him a cure for something that she did to him. That maybe you could argue that Ra kind of wanted her to do. And then taking responsibility for that. And the way to do that, Jung doesn't really go into exactly how to do that. That's what we do here. That's what we do at Animus, the next generation of Jung. One of the next generations. Obviously not complete, but I think we have a pretty good picture of your psychology. Is what your emotions are and what taking responsibility for the emotion, for the blame really means. You're not just going to make yourself do it. And if you can't make yourself do it in the short, if you could just take responsibility for what your parents did, then nobody would have parental issues. There's something else going on. There are payoffs involved. It's a little bit more complicated. Thankfully, not too much more complicated, but a little bit more complicated. So how to talk exactly through your emotions so you can really deliver yourself from the mother and take all the good things that are in the mother. All the good things, a treasure that you could not have found unless you regress your libido. That's part of progressing through the stages of adult development. It's not just like one, then the next, and the next, and the next. And yeah, people have this idea of something to the effect of, so which stage of adult development am I in? You're in all the stages all the time. We're always trying to separate, as we're trying to be generative, we're trying to separate from the parents still. These are always things that we're working with. Sometimes we're working with certain stages more than other times, but we're working with them all the time. It's not, okay, keep stepping forward. It's, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, maybe 5 steps back. That's the regression. That's hanging out with your friends when the girl rejects you at the bar and go, whew, it's tough out there. But you keep going. You keep working at it. And through working this process, you gradually deliver yourself from the mother, a process that we have explicated, I think, quite concretely. I mean, it doesn't get more concrete than this. If you have a problem, if you feel stuck, we have an exact way out of it, and it's not simply go do one thing as opposed to another, right? That's not psychology. That's Jordan Peterson. That's Jocko Willink. That's not psychology. That is philosophy about psychology, but that's not psychology. And maybe that's helpful. Good. But if it's not, if you come to a place where you find yourself doing things that you don't want to do and you can't stop yourself, or the inverse, not doing things you need to be doing, then it's time to look at your psychology from a little bit different way. We have great insights from Jung, and then we take it to the next concrete level. And I'll leave it there. We had one question here from a listener. I didn't get any more questions this week. Wow, thanks, guys. Really appreciate that. No, that's awesome. But listener, you know who you are. You know what the issue is. I'll get to it next week. We do free consultations. animusempire.com/schedule. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching. Joy, pain, reality. I wish you all those great things.